The mahogany conference table stretched like an altar before Richard Whitmore as he leaned forward, his manicured fingers drumming against quarterly reports that showed another billion in revenue. At 52, he commanded rooms with the quiet authority that only generational wealth could cultivate. The floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan headquarters framed the city below, a kingdom he'd helped build with algorithms and ambition. The diversity initiative is bleeding money. Bradley, his son and VP of operations, was saying. These community outreach programs. The words became distant echoes as Richard's vision blurred. The familiar weight of his Patek Philippe watch suddenly felt crushing against his wrist. His chest tightened, not with the usual stress of corporate warfare, but with something primal and terrifying. "Dad!" Bradley's voice cut through the fog. "Dad, are you?" Richard's body betrayed him then, muscles seizing as he pitched forward. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the horrified faces of his board members. 12 white men in identical suits, frozen in their leather chairs like monuments to privilege. The ambulance screamed through Manhattan traffic, its siren a desperate prayer against time. Richard's unconscious mind drifted through fragments of his carefully constructed life. The private jet that whisked him away from uncomfortable realities, the Hamptons estate where gardeners and housekeepers moved like ghosts through his peripheral vision, the charity galas where he wrote checks to ease his conscience without ever meeting the faces behind the causes. "We're losing him," a paramedic's voice pierced the haze. BP's dropping fast. In the sterile corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital, Richard's body became a puzzle that money couldn't solve. Dr. Sarah Chen's team ran test after test, their faces growing more perplexed with each inconclusive result. The neurological symptoms defied explanation. Muscle weakness, cognitive disruption, breathing irregularities that appeared and vanished without pattern. As machines monitored his failing systems, Richard's subconscious wrestled with memories he'd never allowed himself to examine. The casual way he'd crossed streets to avoid certain neighborhoods. The assumptions he'd made about intelligence based on accents and appearances. The comfortable distance he'd maintained from anyone who didn't look like him or share his zip code. His body fought for survival while his mind confronted a lifetime of willful blindness. Prejudices so deeply embedded they'd become invisible, like the golden cage that had protected him from ever truly seeing the world beyond his privilege. The monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm, counting down moments in a life that had never learned to count the cost of its comfort. The 4:30 a.m. alarm pierced through the thin walls of the Harlem apartment like a blade. Marcus Thompson's eyes snapped open in the darkness, his body already conditioned to move before his mind fully awakened. At 16, he carried the weight of responsibility that most adults never knew, the sole provider for his diabetic grandmother in a world that seemed designed to keep them both invisible. The subway platform buzzed with the pre-dawn army of service workers. Housekeepers, security guards, hospital staff, all moving like shadows through a city that would soon fill with people who never saw them. Marcus clutched his worn backpack, medical textbooks borrowed from the library, weighing down his shoulders alongside the industrial cleaning supplies that marked his station in life. 3 buses, 90 minutes each way. The mathematics of poverty calculated in time stolen from dreams. Mount Sinai Hospital rose before him like a fortress of glass and steel, its windows catching the first hints of sunrise. Marcus badged in through the service entrance, avoiding eye contact with the security guard who always looked at him like he was casing the joint rather than reporting for work. "Thompson," Supervisor Janet Martinez called out, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who'd climbed one rung higher on the ladder and intended to guard it fiercely. "ICU needs a deep clean. Room 314 especially, some VIP patient. Don't touch anything you don't need to." The words carried their familiar sting. Don't touch. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist beyond the function you serve. Marcus pushed his cart through corridors that hummed with purpose and privilege. Doctors swept past in their white coats like modern priests, their stethoscopes draped around their necks like symbols of divine knowledge. Nurses clustered around stations, their conversations flowing over and around him as if he were furniture. "Excuse me," he said softly to a passing resident, stepping aside as the young doctor brushed past without acknowledgement. Room 314 held the antiseptic smell of expensive medicine and quiet desperation. Richard Whitmore lay unconscious, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed their electronic prayers. Marcus had seen enough illness to recognize the particular stillness of a body fighting for its life. As he began mopping the floor with practiced efficiency, something caught his attention. The patient's breathing irregular, but not random. There was a pattern, subtle but distinct, that reminded him of nights spent watching his grandmother struggle through diabetic episodes. The way the man's eyes moved beneath closed lids, the slight tremor in his hands. Marcus paused, his mop handle gripping tighter as recognition dawned. He'd seen this before. "Nurse!" He called to a woman updating charts at the bedside. You think what?" Nurse Rebecca Walsh turned, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to outright dismissal as she took in his uniform, his age, his skin color. "You're here to clean, not think." But his breathing pattern, it's like what? "You're a doctor now." Her voice carried the particular cruelty reserved for those who dared step outside their assigned roles. "Stick to what you know, kid." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable designed to remind him of his place. Marcus felt the familiar burn of shame and frustration, the way his intelligence was dismissed before it could even be heard. In this sterile world of healing, he was nothing more than invisible hands pushing a mop. But as he continued cleaning, his eyes never left the patient. The pattern persisted: breathing, eye movement, the subtle signs his grandmother had taught him to recognize through years of midnight vigils and emergency room visits. He knew something important. The question was whether anyone would ever listen to a poor black kid with a mop. The fluorescent lights in the ICU cast harsh shadows across Dr. Sarah Chen's face as she studied Richard Whitmore's latest test results. 48 hours of medical expertise had yielded nothing but questions wrapped in expensive futility. The neurological symptoms defied every textbook she'd memorized, every case study she'd analyzed during her 15-year career. "This is unacceptable." Bradley Whitmore's voice cut through the sterile air like a scalpel. He stood in the hallway outside his father's room, his designer suit wrinkled from sleepless nights, his privilege weaponized into barely contained rage. "My father is dying while you people play guessing games." Dr. Chun felt the familiar weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders, the burden of being one of the few Asian women in a field dominated by white men, where every mistake was magnified and every success diminished. She'd fought for respect in rooms where her accent was mocked and her competence questioned, only to find herself facing a different kind of prejudice now. "Mr. Whitmore, we're exploring every possible." "Are you?" Bradley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because from where I stand, it looks like my father is getting substandard care. Maybe we need doctors who actually went to American medical schools." The words hung in the air like poison. Dr. Chen's jaw tightened, her hands clenching the clipboard until her knuckles went white. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Johns Hopkins, published groundbreaking research, saved countless lives. But in this moment, she was reduced to the color of her skin and the shape of her eyes. 3 floors below, Marcus Thompson sat in the hospital's basement break room, his notebook spread open on the scratch table. For 2 days, he'd been documenting everything: breathing patterns, eye movements, the subtle changes in Richard's condition that seemed to follow a rhythm only he could see. The pages were filled with careful observations, times, correlations that painted a picture the medical team couldn't see. "Thompson," Supervisor Martinez's voice cracked like a whip. "My office. Now." The walk down the narrow corridor felt like a death march. Martinez's office was a cramped space filled with schedules and complaints, the bureaucratic heart of invisible labor. "I've been getting calls," Martinez said, not bothering to look up from her paperwork. "Nurses saying you're bothering them, asking questions above your pay grade. I'm just trying to help." "Help?" Martinez's laugh was bitter. "You're a janitor, Marcus. Your job is to clean, not play doctor. These people don't want your help. They want you to stay in your lane." The words echoed in Marcus's mind as he returned to his rounds. Stay in your lane. Know your place. Be invisible. But how could he remain silent when he watched Richard's condition deteriorate, when he saw the signs that everyone else missed? That evening, as Richard's vital signs took another alarming dip, Marcus stood outside room 314, his notebook clutched against his chest. Inside, machines beeped their urgent warnings while a man slowly died. And Marcus carried the weight of knowledge that no one would hear. The seizure began at 3:17 a.m., when the ICU was bathed in the ghostly blue glow of monitors and the soft shuffle of night shift nurses. Marcus was emptying trash bins when Richard Whitmore's body suddenly went rigid, his back arching off the hospital bed in a violent spasm that sent alarms screaming through the unit. Dr. Chun rushed in, her team close behind, their movements precise and practiced. But Marcus saw what they couldn't. This wasn't a typical seizure. The pattern was wrong, the timing off. It matched exactly what he documented in his notebook, the episodes his grandmother experienced when her blood sugar crashed dangerously low. "It's not neurological," Marcus said, stepping forward as the medical team worked frantically around Richard's convulsing form. "It's metabolic. His glucose levels? Get him out of here," Dr. Chun snapped, not even looking up as she prepared an anti-seizure medication. Security. But Marcus couldn't stop himself. 3 days of watching, documenting, being dismissed had built to this moment. "You're treating the wrong thing. Check his blood sugar, please. Just check. What the hell is going on here?" Bradley Whitmore's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He'd been sleeping in the family lounge, and now stood in the doorway, his face twisted with exhaustion and rage. His eyes locked onto Marcus, young, black, desperate, and something ugly flickered across his features. "This kid is harassing my father," Bradley snarled, pointing an accusatory finger. "He's been lurking around here for days, bothering the staff, and now he's interfering with medical treatment." The security guards arrived like storm clouds, their hands already moving toward Marcus's arms. The room fell silent except for the mechanical breathing of machines and the soft beeping of monitors. Every eye was on Marcus, some filled with sympathy, others with judgment, all of them seeing a black teenager who had dared to speak in a space where his voice didn't belong. "I was just trying to help," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking as the guards flanked him. "I know what's wrong with him. You know nothing." Bradley's words dripped with contempt. "You're a janitor, a child. Stay away from my family." As security escorted Marcus from the room, he caught Dr. Chen's eye for just a moment. Something flickered there, doubt, perhaps, or recognition. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the professional mask she'd learned to wear in a world that questioned her competence at every turn. The hallway felt endless as Marcus walked between the guards, past nurses who averted their eyes and residents who whispered among themselves. Some faces showed embarrassment, others satisfaction. The divide was clear, those who saw a young man trying to help, and those who saw an uppity kid who needed to learn his place. In the elevator, Marcus stared at his reflection in the polished steel doors. The notebook in his pocket felt heavier than lead, filled with observations that might save a life but would never be heard. He thought of his grandmother, of the dreams she'd sacrificed to raise him, of the medical school applications hidden in his bedroom drawer. For the first time since starting this job, Marcus wondered if he was fighting a battle he could never win. The hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m. was a graveyard of fluorescent lights and empty tables, populated only by the night shift workers who existed in the margins of the medical world. Marcus sat alone in the corner, his untouched sandwich growing stale as he stared at his notebook, the pages now feeling like evidence of his own foolishness. The soft click of heels on linoleum announced Patricia Williams before she spoke. At 43, she moved with the quiet authority of someone who had survived 2 decades in a profession that demanded perfection while offering little respect. Her scrubs were crisp despite the long shift, her natural hair pulled back in a style that was both professional and defiant. A small rebellion in a world that preferred her invisible. "Mind if I sit?" Patricia's voice carried the warm cadence of someone who had learned to navigate hostile waters with grace. Marcus looked up, surprised. In 3 months of working at the hospital, no medical staff member had ever voluntarily shared his space. "It's a free country," he said, then immediately regretted the bitter edge in his voice. Patricia settled into the plastic chair across from him, her dark eyes studying his face with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen too many young black men broken by systems designed to crush them. She had witnessed the confrontation in the ICU, had seen the way security escorted him out like a criminal, had felt the familiar burn of injustice that never quite faded. "I saw what happened upstairs," she said quietly. "With the Whitmore patient." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then you saw me get put in my place. I saw a young man trying to help while everyone else was too proud to listen." Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of shared experience. "What did you see that they missed?" For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Trust was a luxury he'd learned not to afford, especially in places where his presence was merely tolerated. But something in Patricia's eyes, a recognition, a kinship born of similar struggles, made him open his notebook. "The breathing patterns," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The eye movements, the timing of the episodes. It's not neurological. It's metabolic acidosis, probably from undiagnosed diabetes or a related condition." Patricia studied his careful documentation, her expression growing more serious with each page. 20 years of nursing had taught her to recognize medical insight regardless of its source, and what she saw in Marcus's observations was the kind of pattern recognition that saved lives. "You're right," she said simply, and those two words hit Marcus like a physical force. "The question is, what do we do about it?" The weight of that "we" settled between them. Two black professionals separated by age and position but united by the understanding that their voices carried less weight in rooms where life and death decisions were made. Patricia faced her own crossroads. Challenge a system that had grudgingly accepted her after years of proving herself, or watch a man die while remaining safely silent. "If I speak up," Patricia said, her voice heavy with the mathematics of survival, "they'll say I'm overstepping, that I'm letting emotions cloud my judgment. If you speak up, they'll call security again," Marcus finished. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces as they contemplated the impossible choice between conscience and survival. In the distance, monitors beeped their electronic prayers for a man whose life hung in the balance of their courage. Patricia closed the notebook and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "Sometimes doing what's right means risking everything you've worked for." The question hung in the air between them. Were they brave enough to try? The code blue alarm shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 5:43 a.m., sending the ICU into controlled chaos as Richard Whitmore's vital signs plummeted toward flatline. Dr. Chen's hands moved with practiced precision, but beneath her clinical exterior, doubt gnawed at her confidence like acid. 3 days of treatment had yielded nothing but deterioration, and the weight of failure pressed against her chest with each labored breath from her patient. Patricia Williams appeared at her elbow as the immediate crisis stabilized, her presence both unexpected and somehow inevitable. The two women had worked parallel shifts for years, their interactions limited to professional courtesies that masked the complex dynamics of race and hierarchy in the medical world. "Dr. Chun." Patricia's voice was steady, professional, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "I need to show you something, privately." The break room felt smaller with the weight of what Patricia carried. Marcus's notebook, its pages filled with observations that could either save a life or destroy careers. Dr. Chen's initial resistance melted as she studied the meticulous documentation, her medical training recognizing the pattern even as her pride recoiled from its source. "This is..." Dr. Chen's voice trailed off as the pieces clicked into place. "Diabetic ketoacidosis with neurological presentation. It's rare in older patients, almost unheard of as a first presentation, but it fits," Patricia finished. "Every symptom, every episode. The kids saw what we missed." The revelation hit Dr. Chun like a physical blow. She thought of her years of training, her prestigious degrees, her carefully constructed reputation. All of it had been useless compared to the observations of a 16-year-old janitor whose insights she dismissed without consideration. The bitter taste of her own prejudice filled her mouth as she realized how quickly she'd categorized Marcus, not as a potential source of medical insight, but as an interruption to be managed. "If this is correct," Dr. Chun whispered, We've been treating him for the wrong condition entirely. 3 floors below, Marcus faced his own reckoning. Supervisor Martinez stood in the security office, her face a mask of bureaucratic satisfaction as she delivered the verdict that had been building since his first attempt to speak. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation, Martinez announced. Multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior, disrupting medical procedures, harassing staff. The words felt like physical blows, each one designed to remind him of his place in the hospital's rigid hierarchy. Marcus thought of his grandmother, waiting at home with her insulin and her unwavering faith in his potential. He thought of the medical school applications hidden in his drawer, dreams that seemed to crumble with each accusation. Mrs. Thompson. The security guard's voice was not unkind as he escorted Marcus to collect his belongings. Your grandson's got heart, but this ain't the place for it. The walk to the service exit felt endless, past nurses who averted their eyes and residents who whispered among themselves. Some faces showed sympathy, others satisfaction, but all of them reinforced the same message. Know your place, stay in your lane, accept your limitations. At home, his grandmother's weathered hands held his face as tears he'd been holding back finally fell. Baby, she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had fought similar battles for 7 decades. Sometimes the world tries to make you small so it can stay comfortable, but truth has a way of rising up, even when they try to bury it. Outside, the city awakened to another day, unaware that in a hospital room across town, a man's life hung in the balance of courage and conscience. The lab results arrived at 11:47 a.m., their stark numbers confirming what Dr. Chun had hoped against hope would be wrong. Blood glucose, 420 milligrams per deciliter. Ketones, severely elevated. pH, dangerously acidic. Every marker screamed the diagnosis that a 16-year-old janitor had identified while an entire medical team had chased shadows. Dr. Chen's hands trembled as she held the printout, the weight of professional humiliation crushing against her chest. In the sterile quiet of the lab, surrounded by machines that dealt only in facts, she confronted the devastating truth. Her expertise, her years of training, her carefully constructed reputation had been useless compared to the observations of someone she dismissed without a second thought. Patricia, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to change everything. Now. The ICU transformed into controlled urgency as the treatment protocol shifted from neurological intervention to metabolic crisis management. Insulin drips replaced anti-seizure medications. Fluid balance calculations replaced brain scans. Within hours, Richard Whitmore's vital signs began to stabilize for the first time in 4 days, his body responding to treatment that addressed the actual problem rather than its symptoms. Dr. Chun watched the monitors with a mixture of relief and shame, knowing that every improved reading was evidence of her failure to listen. The medical team worked with renewed purpose, but beneath their professional efficiency lay an uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. They had nearly lost a patient because they couldn't imagine that insight might come from someone who pushed a mop. Bradley Whitmore stood in the hallway outside his father's room, his designer suit wrinkled from days of vigil, his face a mask of confusion and barely contained rage. The improvement in his father's condition should have brought relief, but the explanation Dr. Chun had just delivered left him reeling with cognitive dissonance that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed worldview. You're telling me, Bradley's voice was low, dangerous, that some kid figured out what you couldn't? Dr. Chun met his gaze steadily, her own shame transformed into something harder, more resolute. Marcus Thompson identified a rare presentation of diabetic ketoacidosis that we missed. His observations were accurate, detailed, and ultimately saved your father's life. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Bradley's mind raced through the implications, his prejudices warring with undeniable reality. The cleaning boy he'd dismissed, the uppity kid he'd had removed by security, had possessed the knowledge that his father's life depended on. The contradiction threatened to tear apart everything he believed about intelligence, worth, and who deserved to be heard. That's impossible, Bradley whispered, but even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. He's what? Dr. Chen's voice carried a steel that surprised them both. Young? Black? Poor? None of those things make his observations less valid or his insight less valuable. In the ICU, Richard Whitmore's breathing grew steadier with each passing hour, his body healing under treatment that addressed the root cause rather than its manifestations. The machines that had screamed warnings for days now hummed with quiet efficiency, monitoring a recovery that had seemed impossible just hours before. Bradley stared through the window at his unconscious father, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Everything he'd been taught about merit, intelligence, and social hierarchy crumbled in the face of this impossible truth. A poor black teenager had saved his father's life while he had stood by, his privilege and prejudice blinding him to the very help they needed. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable, gratitude and racism warring in his chest like opposing forces. How could he reconcile owing his father's life to someone he'd been raised to see as inferior? How could he maintain his worldview when reality had just shattered it so completely? In the distance, monitors beeped their steady rhythm, counting heartbeats that might have been lost forever if not for the courage of those willing to speak truth to power. The first thing Richard Whitmore saw when consciousness returned was light. Not the harsh fluorescent glare he'd grown accustomed to, but the soft golden rays of afternoon sun streaming through hospital windows. His throat felt raw, his body weak, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. The fog of illness had lifted, leaving behind a strange sense of rebirth. Dr. Chen appeared at his bedside, her expression a complex mixture of relief and something else. Humility, perhaps, or the weight of hard-learned lessons. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, "how are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck." Richard's voice was hoarse but steady. "But alive. What happened to me?" The explanation came in careful, measured tones. Diabetic ketoacidosis, a rare presentation, a diagnosis that had eluded the medical team until it was almost too late. But it was the final part of Dr. Chen's account that stopped Richard's world entirely. The correct diagnosis was first identified by Marcus Thompson, one of our custodial staff. His observations were instrumental in saving your life. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. In his mind, he saw flashes of his unconscious prejudices. The way he'd crossed streets, the assumptions he'd made, the comfortable distance he'd maintained from anyone who didn't look like him. A janitor, a black teenager, someone he would have dismissed without a second thought had saved his life. 2 hours later, Marcus stood hesitantly in the doorway of room 314, his uniform replaced by street clothes, his suspension notice still burning in his pocket. Patricia Williams had convinced him to come, though every instinct told him to stay away from the world that had rejected him so completely. "Come in." Richard's voice was quiet but firm. "Please." Marcus approached the bed slowly, his eyes taking in the man whose life he'd helped save. Pale, vulnerable, stripped of the armor of wealth and power that had defined him. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared experience filling the space between them. "I owe you my life," Richard said finally, the words carrying a weight that surprised them both. "You don't owe me anything," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I just saw something that needed to be seen." Richard studied the young man's face, intelligent, determined, carrying himself with a dignity that no amount of dismissal could diminish. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A doctor," Marcus answered without hesitation. "I want to help people." The simple honesty of the response cut through Richard like a blade. Here was someone with the insight to save lives, the compassion to care, the intelligence to succeed, and the system had tried to silence him because of the color of his skin and the circumstances of his birth. "Then you will be," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "I'll make sure of it." In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. Not the artificial gratitude of obligation, but the recognition of shared humanity that transcended every barrier society had built to keep them apart. 6 months later, the gleaming conference room at Whitmore Technologies buzzed with a different kind of energy. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table where his journey had begun, but the faces around him had changed. Diverse voices now filled seats that had once been occupied exclusively by men who looked like him. The Thompson Medical Scholarship Foundation had become his obsession, a way to channel his awakening into something tangible and lasting. "We've received over 3,000 applications," Dr. Chun reported, her role as the foundation's medical director marking her own transformation from reluctant participant to passionate advocate. The stack of folders before her represented dreams deferred, potential unrealized, brilliance hidden behind zip codes and circumstances. "The need is overwhelming," Richard nodded, his fingers drumming against the same table where he'd collapsed months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. In this room where he'd once dismissed diversity initiatives as bleeding money, he now poured millions into breaking down the very barriers he'd helped maintain. But change, he'd learned, was more complex than writing checks. The foundation's first board meeting had been a revelation in itself. When Richard announced his intention to fund medical education for underprivileged students, the response from his peers had been telling. Polite applause masked skeptical glances. Supportive words carried undertones of concern about lowering standards and social experiments. "Richard," board member Harrison Blackwell had said after the meeting, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of old money addressing new conscience, "this is admirable, but we need to be careful about creating dependencies. These people need to learn to pull themselves up by their bootstraps." The phrase had hit Richard like a physical blow, forcing him to confront how many times he'd used similar language to justify his own indifference. Now, seeing the world through different eyes, he recognized the cruel mathematics of that philosophy. How could someone pull themselves up by bootstraps they'd never been given? "Harrison," Richard had replied, his voice steady but firm. "Marcus Thompson saved my life with intelligence and insight that our entire medical team missed. He didn't need bootstraps. He needed someone to listen." The uncomfortable silence that followed had been worth every awkward moment. At Columbia University's pre-med program, Marcus Thompson walked across campus with his head high, his scholarship letter folded carefully in his backpack alongside textbooks he could finally afford. The autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet as he navigated between worlds. The Harlem apartment where his grandmother still struggled with medical bills, and the ivy-covered halls where his presence was both celebrated and questioned. The transition hadn't been seamless. Marcus found himself constantly code-switching, adjusting his speech patterns and mannerisms to fit into spaces that weren't designed for someone like him. Study groups fell silent when he approached, conversations shifting from casual to performatively inclusive. Professors praised his articulate responses with surprise that felt like backhanded compliments. Classmates asked if he was there on special admission, their questions wrapped in curiosity that barely concealed their assumptions. The library had become his sanctuary, its quiet corners offering refuge from the constant scrutiny. But even there, he felt the weight of representation, every grade, every comment, every interaction becoming evidence for or against the worthiness of people who looked like him. "Thompson," Professor Williams called after organic chemistry class, his tone carrying the particular condescension reserved for students who didn't fit the traditional mold. "I hope you understand that standards here won't be lowered to accommodate your background." The words stung with familiar precision, each syllable designed to remind Marcus that his place here was conditional, temporary, subject to constant scrutiny. He'd traded the invisibility of janitorial work for the hypervisibility of being the scholarship kid, the diversity admission, the exception that proved the rule. "I understand, Professor," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "I'm here because I earned it." The professor's smile was thin, unconvinced. "We'll see." But Marcus had allies now. Dr. Chun had become an unexpected mentor, using her position to open doors and amplify his voice. She understood the weight of being the only one in the room, the exhaustion of constantly proving your worth to people who questioned your right to exist in their spaces. "Don't let them make you smaller," she told him during one of their monthly coffee meetings, her own journey from dismissive physician to passionate advocate evident in every word. "Your perspective isn't a liability. It's exactly what medicine needs." Their conversations had become lifelines, moments where Marcus could drop the mask of perpetual gratitude and speak honestly about the isolation, the microaggressions, the way success felt simultaneously empowering and suffocating. In the hospital where it all began, Patricia Williams had been promoted to charge nurse, her advocacy for Marcus having opened doors she'd never expected. But even her new position came with whispered comments about affirmative action and unqualified promotions, reminders that progress was often viewed through the lens of suspicion rather than merit. The night shift had become her domain, and she used it to mentor young nurses of color, teaching them to navigate the treacherous waters of institutional medicine. She'd learned that change happened one conversation at a time, one moment of courage building upon another. "You have to be twice as good to get half as much," she told the young nurses during their informal mentoring sessions. "But don't let that make you bitter. Let it make you better." Her office walls were covered with thank you cards from patients whose lives had been saved by staff members who felt empowered to speak up, to challenge assumptions, to see beyond the surface. Each card represented a small victory against a system that preferred silence to truth. Richard's own journey proved equally complex. His attempts to diversify his company's leadership met resistance from board members who smiled politely while undermining his initiatives behind closed doors. Shareholders questioned his social justice phase, as if recognizing human dignity was a temporary affliction rather than a moral imperative. The corporate culture Richard had shaped over decades did not unravel in a single night. It was stitched into policies, woven into habits, whispered through traditions that had calcified into the way things are done. Hiring practices that had quietly favored certain schools, family names, and old networks proved stubborn, resistant to dismantling. Promotion criteria that seemed fair on paper, when studied closely, revealed their subtle bias, benchmarks built to reward those who already belonged, while penalizing those who came from the margins. Every proposal to change these systems met resistance, cloaked not in hostility, but in the polished rhetoric of merit and qualifications. At one particularly tense family dinner, Bradley leaned forward, his fork clinking against his plate. His voice trembled with the strain of a man caught between loyalty to his upbringing and the uncomfortable glare of a new world. "Dad," he said, his words tight, deliberate, "this guilt-driven philanthropy is affecting our bottom line. The shareholders are asking questions." Richard set his fork down slowly, the quiet gesture louder than any retort. He locked eyes with his son across the expanse of the table. The dining room, once a symbol of control, prestige, and certainty, felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves bowed under the weight of generational reckoning. The chandelier overhead scattered fractured light across the table, illuminating not just their faces, but the widening gulf between old assumptions and emerging truths. "Let them ask," Richard replied finally, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Some things matter more than profit margins." Bradley's brow furrowed, his hands clenching and unclenching as if trying to grasp something intangible. "But do they really? Or are you just trying to ease your conscience? Because if that's all this is—" "It's not," Richard cut in sharply, his conviction startling even himself. His voice carried the weight of survival, of a truth too raw to deny. "Marcus Thompson saw what trained doctors missed. He saved my life while we were too proud to listen. If that doesn't make you question everything we've believed about intelligence, about worth, about who deserves to be heard, then you're not paying attention." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. The conversation that unfolded afterward was painful, necessary, and unfinished. It was a snapshot of the larger battle outside their home, the struggle to shift not just systems but hearts. Richard understood then that his personal awakening was only a door cracked open. Real change, the kind that dismantled decades of institutional racism, demanded more than his transformation. It required relentless effort, difficult conversations, and a willingness to lose the comfort of old friendships that could not bear the discomfort of growth. And yet, the ripples spread. Marcus's story became more than a family memory. It grew into a spark that ignited others. Young people from his neighborhood saw possibility in his success. 3 students from his high school applied to pre-med programs the following year, their applications strengthened by mentorship, funding, and belief, things the foundation now provided. Dr. Chun, once quietly complicit in the biases of her profession, began speaking openly at medical conferences about unconscious prejudice, her words carrying the undeniable authority of someone who had confronted her own blind spots. Patricia's long overdue promotion gave courage to other nurses, who began voicing concerns about injustice instead of swallowing them in silence. The foundation itself grew beyond Richard's initial design. What had begun as a gesture of gratitude became a movement. Corporate partnerships formed as other executives, stirred by Marcus's story, examined their own practices. Medical schools revisited admission criteria, finally acknowledging that their traditional yardsticks might be overlooking extraordinary potential. Hospitals experimented with programs that invited insights from every level of staff: janitors, aides, orderlies, recognizing that wisdom and perception were not confined to white coats. Still, progress was fragile. Every advancement seemed to invite a counterforce. Promising candidates were still dismissed for lacking cultural fit. Innovative ideas were brushed aside because they came from the wrong mouth, the wrong background. Old systems whispered old lies, silencing voices in the name of efficiency, comfort, or tradition. Change arrived slowly, unevenly, with victories punctuated by setbacks. It was imperfect, often exhausting, but it was real. It moved forward not through grand spectacles, but through countless small acts of courage. Someone speaking up in a meeting, a scholarship application strengthened by belief, a boardroom debate that refused to quiet down. The revolution would not be televised. It would be lived, in hospital rooms where a janitor's observation was finally taken seriously, in boardrooms where diverse voices reshaped policy, in classrooms where brilliance was recognized despite the packaging it came in. Richard came to understand that this was the true work, not quick victories, but the slow reshaping of vision. The foundation for change was being laid not in concrete or steel, but in something far more enduring: the reshaping of hearts, the opening of minds. The work was unfinished. It would always be unfinished. But it had begun, and for Richard that was enough.